Welcome to Florida's Cannabis News Podcast, a weekly podcast exploring the legal, political, and economic changes to Florida's cannabis industry, covering important news and events for Florida cannabis businesses and professionals. Sit back and relax. Florida's Cannabis News Podcast begins now.
Hello and welcome. Today is Friday, May 17th, 2019, and you're tuned into Florida's Cannabis News Podcast. This is your host, David, and for the last 10 weeks, I've been here every Friday covering the latest news and events in Florida's cannabis industry. This week, we have a different kind of episode, including an update about our show, so let's dive right into it. Before we get into today's top stories, I want to give an update about the podcast. Florida's Cannabis News Podcast has always been about the legal, economic, and political changes in Florida's cannabis industry. But we want to expand our platform, so we're thinking about rebranding into a new show that's still about the cannabis industry, but we want to rebrand and expand our discussions and education about other areas in the industry. In our new podcast, we will still heavily cover Florida's cannabis industry, but we also want to touch on national headlines that affect Florida's cannabis industry. So on this new platform, I'll be able to bring on guests, whether that's policymakers, attorneys, industry leaders, or other professionals in the space, and those guests will provide awesome content and a more enjoyable show. We're going to transition into the new show into a more of a bi-weekly, monthly talk show where we can really dive deep into the issues for longer periods of time. Instead of providing a 20 to 25 minute weekly episode, we want to provide 40 to 60 minute deeper dialogues every other week, for instance. I'm just starting a full-time job here in Florida, so I will not be able to produce the quality content that I want to give you guys if I force myself to upload an episode every Friday. The rebrand will be much more sustainable and will result in a better product for longer periods of time. So today we will go through the news as usual, but next time we release a new episode, it's going to be under a different name, again still cannabis related and still heavily emphasizing Florida's cannabis industry. But if you're a subscriber, which is free to do on your podcast listening app, nothing is going to change. You'll still get your episodes delivered into your notification center or through your podcast app you use whenever we release a new show. I'm looking forward to continuing talking about these issues. I love talking about this industry because there's so many moving parts on so many different levels. Our Twitter feed is also not going to change either. It will be under the new name, but the content we share and the topics we discuss will all be the same. I'm looking forward to our new platform. Again, as I mentioned, it is still going to be about Florida's cannabis industry, but we are pivoting a little bit so we can add richer content and deeper discussions. This rebrand will not be a huge, significant change, but I wanted to inform you ahead of time because I don't want you to be surprised with the new show. If you still want to continue learning with us about Florida's cannabis industry, stay put. I think you'll like the upcoming change. So with that little update, let's get into this week's top stories. Our first top story this week comes out of Tallahassee, where a last-minute effort by Florida Republican legislators to restrict citizen petition ballot initiatives is only a signature away from becoming law. On the final day of the 2019 legislative session, House Republicans added language to House Bill 5, which is a tax bill that has nothing to do with petition drives. The original intent of House Bill 5 was to restrict the power of municipalities from adding new taxes without due process, which is something actually many citizens support. But at the last minute of our latest legislative session, Republican lawmakers crafted a regulatory spiderweb designed to make it as hard as possible to collect and submit signatures so citizens can propose changes to Florida's Constitution. So the language that was added at the most basic level makes petition drives much harder to accomplish and much harder to really get done. So here's what the language does, and I'll explain what this has to do with cannabis in a second. So under House Bill 5, county elections offices that currently have nothing to do with petition gathering except, verifying the signatures on petitions, are basically going to be placed in charge of printing, distributing, and tracking petitions. Not only that, the language will require petitions to have been marked to identify the person gathering the signatures, the gatherer, and the elections offices would also then have to report to the state how many petitions each gatherer has and how many were returned. Now try to imagine for a second a county elections office being forced to print, keep on hand, and account for thousands of petitions covering more than 24 active ballot initiatives. The elections offices are essentially going to become print shops under this new bill. So, petition gatherers have 30 days from the time a form is signed to turn it into the elections office. But this new language imposes a $50 per day fine if the gatherer turns in petitions late. And the bill makes it a first-degree misdemeanor to pay gatherers on a per-signature basis, which is a common thing nonprofit organizations do to get their initiatives on the voting ballot. So, for example, the bill will impose fines between $50 to $250 for each signature turned in after the 30-day period has expired, and adds fines of upwards of $1,000 for petitions that are willfully not turned in at all. Advocates and nonprofits across the state are urging citizens to call Governor DeSantis and ask him to veto House Bill 5. So Governor DeSantis has 15 days to either veto the bill or sign it once the bill hits his desk. And if he does not veto after the 15-day period, the bill automatically becomes law. Now, if the bill becomes law, in my opinion, the bill and this whole issue will likely end up in the courts. But right now, there's 27 active petition drives seeking to place constitutional amendments on the 2020 general election ballot. Some of those include cannabis. So, just to kind of add context, had this law been in effect during the last two elections, our citizen initiatives, such as the legalization of cannabis, and more recently with the restoration of voting rights for felons, would likely have never made it onto the ballot if all these restrictions were in place. But both ended up being voted into law by an overwhelming majority of voters. Of course, as you know, the legislature then weakened the laws, specifically the cannabis laws, after we voted to have a medical cannabis program, with the implementation of smoking ban and the vertically integrated licenses. Now, as I mentioned, there's a bunch of citizen-led attempts to change the Constitution, which is how we get our laws changed here in Florida. One, it wants to raise the minimum wage. One would let everyone vote in primary elections, including people who identify as independents. So in all, there's more than 25 amendments going around. Many will not make it on the ballot, and the ones that do have to get 60% of the vote, which is already a very high bar to do. But the legislator is not taking any chances with this, and they want to increase the restrictions and the burden for citizens to change the law in the state. Now, these restrictions basically make petition drives impossible because petitioners sometimes don't turn in their signed petitions to campaign coordinators until weeks after they've obtained them. And with these fines imposed, it's going to cause a pretty big mess. This is just so similar to Ray Rodriguez's 10% THC cap sneaking his language into Senate Bill 188, which we covered in a couple episodes previous, but because these citizen initiative provisions, this language they added into HB 5, were all but dead before getting thrown in last minute into this bill on the last day of the legislative session. Now, lawmakers are providing justifications why they like this language. One main argument is that they want to prevent fraud, but they're not really providing evidence that petition fraud is taking place in Florida or that it's a huge concern. This language is going to make it very hard for citizens to get involved in the legislative process in changing the Constitution. But what does this mean for cannabis? Well, as you know, each cannabis legal market we have in the United States today is because of citizen-driven ballot initiatives, except for Vermont, which I'll hit on in 1 second. So lawmakers themselves don't implement cannabis markets on their own. The catalysts are really the grassroots petition gatherers. That's what happened in Florida. Florida got our medical cannabis program by the will of the people. We gathered petitions and finally got Amendment 2 onto the ballot, and then the voters voted on it and passed with 71% of the vote. The language in HB 5 makes that process of getting the amendment onto the Florida ballot much harder to achieve. So, as I mentioned before, Vermont is the only state where the legislature themselves enacted their cannabis program. So in 2018, Vermont legalized cannabis for adult use through the legislative process. They didn't need citizens to gather petitions. They did it themselves. The lawmakers themselves created their program. But they did so without setting up a system, rules and regulations basically for adult use sales. Now, currently, what's going on in Vermont over a year later, the Vermont lawmakers have Senate Bill 54 going through its legislative journey, but recently it's been stalled. Apparently, from the articles I'm reading, adult use sales have no chance to pass this session. So hopefully we see some movement there in Vermont. Back in an earlier episode, we covered an attempt by Florida lawmaker Carlos Guillermo Smith to enact an adult use cannabis program. As we reported, the bill did not get a hearing or a vote. Now, so this was an example, again, of a Florida lawmaker trying to enact an adult use cannabis program through the legislator. But we know legalization in Florida is coming one way or the other, either next year or by 2022. Probably not through the legislator, probably through a ballot initiative. But if this language is enacted, if Governor DeSantis signs HB 5, that process of gathering signatures is going to be much more difficult. Now, we know the Florida recreational market is going to be big because of the size of the state. We have 20 million residents and more than 100 million visitors each year. And that makes the recreational market potentially to be bigger than states like Colorado, Michigan, and Massachusetts, even though Massachusetts really has the gold standard of a cannabis program. If I were to pick one state in the United States to have the best program or to model, if I was the governor of a state and I were to model my cannabis program after a state, it would be Massachusetts. Now, we have two nonprofit organizations that are leading the charge to get recreational cannabis on the ballot in 2020. We have Regulate Florida and Floridians for Freedom. Both organizations have their own petitions that they're trying to get signed for Supreme Court review. I broke down both petitions in an earlier episode. Regulate Florida's petition is 4 pages, their proposed law, and Floridians for Freedom is really a paragraph. Now, I don't really think a paragraph law is better than a 4-page in-depth law because we need regulations in the state. We need rules set up. Now, we should have more movement on HB 5 within the coming weeks, and we'll definitely keep you updated about it. But HB 5 extends more than the cannabis industry. It's going to affect any constitutional amendment Floridians want to see implemented in our state law. Our second top story of the week is an update about Hester Burkhalter, the grandmother who was arrested for having CBD oil in her purse at Disney World last week. So last week we reported that Grandma Hester was arrested at Disney World when she tried to walk through security with CBD oil. Now, this week, we're getting reports that she plans to sue over her arrest. She hired Ben Crump, who is a civil rights attorney most notably known for representing the family of Trayvon Martin, and Mr. Crump is filing a notice of intent to sue not only the Disney Corporation, but the Orange County Sheriff's Department as well. I will post a link to his press conference he had this week. It's around 40 minutes, but basically it's Mr. Crump and his team building emotional rapport with the public about their case. They're also demanding a public apology by the Sheriff's Department. They emphasize in the press conference how inappropriate Orange County Sheriff's actions were by arresting her because of how harmless CBD is. So their lawsuit will be based on unlawful detainment, false imprisonment, defamation of character, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Now, these tort claims, in my opinion, I think the hardest one they're going to the most difficult tort they will have to prove is the IIED, the intentional infliction of emotional distress, because the plaintiff, Hester, has such a high burden to meet one of the elements of that tort, which is extreme and outrageous conduct. She's going to have to prove, whoever she sues, Disney or the sheriff, that their conduct was so extreme and outrageous that it went beyond all possible bounds of decency. Now, that is a very hard burden in the legal industry to meet. So we'll see what they end up doing when they file their complaint. We'll see what their causes of actions are and what evidence they are using to support their claims. But it doesn't seem to me that they might have a strong case to prove intentional infliction of emotional distress because, it's not like the cops slammed her on the floor or did anything so crazy that went beyond the possible bounds of decency, but we'll see what happens. In the press conference, Ben Crump played on the blood and heartstrings of the public when he emphasized how a cherished vacation-going grandmother who wanted to give this trip just to her kids was victimized by the Sheriff's Department. Attorney Crump also emphasized that her CBD oil was recommended by her doctor for arthritis. Now, Hester obtained her CBD oil in North Carolina, and North Carolina has a super limited cannabis program. It's illegal for recreational adult use and for basically most medical use, with an extremely narrow exception for medical purposes. They have a low THC program, but she said her CBD oil was recommended by her doctor. Mr. Crump also really emphasized in the press conference how you can go and buy CBD oil in really any Florida gas station or vitamin center. And he brought up how, why are we arresting this grandmother for possession of CBD oil when you could walk down the street from Disney World in Orlando and buy the CBD oil on the shelf with no need for a medical card or being a qualified patient in the state. I went to a gas station this week and they were selling CBD flour. They were selling flour with that was labeled 0% THC with around 15% CBD in a gas station. During this altercation at the security line in Disney World, officers conducted a field presumptive test. Here's the thing with field presumptive tests. The ones that are used are not able to detect the hemp-derived CBD from the THC, so it's always going to test positive. The only way we're actually going to be able to know the difference between the CBD and the THC content is to send it to a lab. Disney World has not made a public comment. I'm not sure if they will, but Disney World, upon Ms. Buckhalter being arrested, banned her from all Disney properties. And in order to obtain their belongings from her hotel room, her husband had to drop her off at a McDonald's where she waited for over 2 hours while he was only allowed to go back to the hotel room and gather the belongings. Later, a Disney spokesperson said that the ban was lifted and she was allowed to go back onto Disney properties. Now, there are different ways a case can be brought to the state attorney's office. One of those ways, obviously, is when the person is arrested. But another way is through what is called an at-large filing. And in this process here, the sheriff's office simply gives affidavits to the state attorney, and the state attorney ends up deciding whether to effectuate charges. Here, the sheriff's office did not do this. Instead, she was embarrassed in front of everybody. But upon getting this case, the prosecutor then expedited this case to her supervisor, and it was dropped within 12 hours. The reason being because a lot of times in these CBD lab tests, it comes back negative for THC. So that tells me, although this is one case at one time, how many other arrests have been made as a result of assuming the CBD oil has THC in it. The deputy on site never asked for a prescription or her doctor's note, even though Ms. Buckhalter told him, I have a doctor's recommendation, but he never asked about it himself. Now again, this arrest was made because of the field presumptive test that came back positive for THC, even though her bottle said no THC on it. Now when companies advertise their products as no THC, they could be, we really don't know because if they're telling the truth, because they could have that trace amounts of THC that less than 0.3%. So tests will still pick it up tests will still pick up the THC content, even though they're saying, hey, listen, we have basically 0% THC because this product is not going to give you psychoactive effects, but it could have 0.1% THC. So this ties in again to our federal farm bill discussion we had in last week's episode, because the federal farm bill allows states to enact their own hemp programs. Now remember, CBD has been on the rise. The hype of CBD has been on the rise since the Farm Bill was signed in December, which removes hemp, which is defined as cannabis, derivatives of the cannabis plant with less than 0.3% THC, from the Federal Controlled Substances Act that Richard Nixon passed into law in the early 1970s, I think in 71 or 72. Now, CBD at the federal level is legalized, but this doesn't mean you can really walk around with it still. Because these sheriff's office, I guess, are not really educated about the laws and they're still arresting people. Just because hemp-derived CBD is legalized at the federal level, that doesn't mean it's legalized at the state level, even though we have gas stations and, other stores that are selling the product. States still need to roll out their hemp programs, and until then, if you don't buy CBD in a legal state, or if you buy it in a medical state and you're a qualified patient, you run the risk of getting arrested by these officers. Yes, restaurants and smoke shops do sell the CBD in food and via tincture, or in the case that I saw this week with whole flower. these entities are running the risk of being persecuted. Nikki Fried, our Commissioner of Agriculture, said she will go after retailers who make medical claims, but she doesn't plan on going after consumers. But that's not stopping sheriffs. So, for example, that's not stopping the Orange County sheriffs from arresting people when they see CBD oil. Now, CBD remains illegal in Florida if you're not outside of the MMTC world. But 2 weeks ago, our legislator passed Senate Bill 1020, which removes hemp and hemp-derived products, including CBD, from Florida's controlled substances list. The bill is still waiting for approval by Governor Ron DeSantis, but when it is signed, it will go into effect July 1st, and CBD will not be a controlled substance anymore. Again, is CBD legal or illegal? The answer is yes. It's 2019, and we're living through a very, very interesting legal transition of this plant. We're in a period in which hemp-derived CBD is allowed nationwide, but it's also prohibited locally. It's the opposite of what you know as cannabis, which is prohibited nationwide but allowed locally. It's super interesting. But people are still getting arrested. So, for example, in Oklahoma, we have a Marine who served in Afghanistan and Iraq and is facing 18 years to life for providing security for a tractor-trailer load of state-certified hemp from Kentucky. In Idaho, we have an Oregon truck driver who was charged with drug trafficking for hauling hemp through Idaho in early April. In Ohio, we have a 31-year-old man who is charged with a felony for possessing half an ounce of CBD oil he consumes for anxiety. In Nebraska, we have a mother and her son who opened a CBD shop days after the passage of the 2018 Farm Bill who were arrested for selling the products. In North Carolina, we have a 16-year-old high school student who was handcuffed and taken to jail when the police department found in a random search medicinal CBD in her backpack. In Louisiana, we have an owner of a Lafayette CBD store who was arrested in a raid last month and charged with drug trafficking. I could go on, and it's just, I'm trying to show that this is a gray area, and it's turned darker by the uncertainty created by the regulation of the 2018 Farm Bill, which has the states writing the rules, making all CBD extract products and CBD flower not sold from an MMTC currently illegal. But the enforcement of our current law is at the discretion of local law enforcement, it appears. My point is we need to solidify the CBD laws and instill robust reciprocity to protect the patients. As I've mentioned on numerous occasions, the FDA is having a meeting on May 31st, and hopefully CBD will be talked about at this meeting. I'm excited to see what's going to be said, and of course, I will report back with a full breakdown of the meeting. I think CBD will be legal in some form, of course, of human consumption at some point, but right now, living day to day in this gray area is super interesting, a lot of legal issues, and it's just fun to watch this industry develop right before our eyes. Our last top story of the week is a licensing story because Green Peak Innovations, GPI, one of Michigan's largest vertically integrated cannabis companies, recently announced the acquisition of one of Florida's 22 highly sought-after MMTC licenses. Now, Governor DeSantis just issued more licenses. We have a full breakdown of the 8 newly licensed MMTCs in a previous episode, but GPI has purchased one of these 8 new licenses. I'm not sure which one because the details of the acquisition remain confidential currently at this time. And while the acquisition hit this week, details remain unknown, including the name of Florida's MMTC license holder. So this is an example of a multi-state operator, GPI, Green Peak Innovations from Michigan, obtaining another license in another state, Florida, and continuing their operations in Florida. It's super cool how all of these multi-state operators move into different states and continue their operations under the Green Peak, under their name brand. We will find out later what license they bought, but until then, we are kind of in the dark. As a reminder, we do have all of our news we cover here on the podcast linked on our Twitter account _FL Cannabis News. So follow us on Twitter to get these updates. Join the conversation during the week. We'd love to talk on there. This week's weekly patient count from Florida's Office of Medical Marijuana Use brings us to 218,490 patients. As you know, the office releases their weekly update on Friday afternoons after this episode goes live, so I'm going to leave a link, as I usually do, in the show notes so you can go and click and see the updated number. Those are our top stories of the week. Let's move into upcoming events. On May 20th, Curaleaf is presenting a Marijuana 101 seminar where you can learn more about the plant and how it could help you and your medical needs. Tickets are free and the location is in Kissimmee, Florida, specifically Kissimmee Gardens, 2551 Tohop Boulevard, Kissimmee, Florida 34741. I will post a ticket link below in the show notes. Again, it is free on May 20th. It'll be a great time. On May 23rd, Cannabis Lab is having their monthly event at the Mercias Hotel in Miami Beach. This month's event is going to be a legislative update. As always, Cannabis Lab is an amazing time. Tickets will be $50, but if you join as a full-time member and you're in the South Florida area, it's $300 for the year and you get free entry. That's it for Florida's top cannabis news and events. If you have any stories or events you'd like us to share, head on over to our Twitter account _FL Cannabis News or email us at floridacannabisnewspodcast@gmail.com. If you like our content and you're a weekly listener or you're just dropping in for the first time, subscribe, rate us 5 stars on iTunes, it goes a long way, and share with your friends who might be interested in this content. Thank you again for staying up to date with Florida's cannabis industry. I'll be back with you again soon for another news-filled episode of our podcast. Have a great weekend.